Good evening. It is May 5th, 2026, and 4 days from now, Vladimir Putin is going to stand in Red Square and preside over the single most humiliating moment of his entire political career. Not humiliating because something went catastrophically wrong. Humiliating because of what is going to be completely, conspicuously, devastatingly absent. No tanks, no missile launchers, no armored columns, no intercontinental ballistic missiles rolling through Moscow, no military cadets, no dignitaries from world powers standing beside him. Just a handful of soldiers marching in silence, a few jets doing a flyover, and a man who has spent 2 decades building a global reputation as the world's most dangerous strongman, standing there with absolutely nothing to show for it. And he begged. He actually begged to make sure that even this sad, stripped-down shell of a parade would go off without a scratch. That is where Russia is on May 5th, 2026. And if you want to understand what this Victory Day tells us about the real state of the Ukraine war, you need to stay with me, because the details are more devastating than most coverage is letting on. Russia will not display military hardware in this year's parade commemorating 81 years since the Soviet victory over Nazi Germany in World War II. The Defense Ministry confirmed the event, typically marked with a bombastic show of military strength, is scheduled for May 9th in Moscow's Red Square. And the reasoning they gave, the official on-record explanation from the Russian Ministry of Defense, was that military schools, Cadet Corps, and the military hardware column will not be participating due to the current operational situation. That is the most bureaucratic way of saying your army is getting shredded in Ukraine that I have ever read. The current operational situation. As if that covers it. It will be the first time in nearly 2 decades, and in the more than 4 years of Russia's war in Ukraine, that no military equipment will rumble through Moscow's Red Square on May 9th. Victory Day parades on Red Square involved military equipment and various weaponry every year since 2008, 18 consecutive years. Every year since 2008, Putin made sure the world watched tanks and missiles roll through the heart of Moscow. It was his political theater. It was his annual message to NATO, to the West, to his own population. Look at what we have. Look at what we can do. Look at how powerful we are. And now, in 2026, after 4 years of a war he told the world would last 3 days, that entire tradition collapses. The tanks are gone. Not because Putin chose not to display them, but because he cannot. This marks a profound departure from Russia's post-Soviet military doctrine, which has consistently prioritized public displays of force as a core element of national identity and deterrence. The inability to stage such a fundamental demonstration signals a strategic exhaustion far beyond mere logistical challenges, undermining decades of carefully cultivated image. Now let's talk about the begging, because that is the part that nobody is covering with the seriousness it deserves. Putin held a phone call with US President Donald Trump on April 29th, during which the Russian leader expressed readiness to declare a temporary pause in fighting around Russia's May 9th Victory Day commemorations. Think about the architecture of that sentence. Putin called Trump to ask for help protecting his parade from Ukraine. The man who invaded a sovereign country in what his own propaganda machine called a special military operation that would be over in days, is now on the phone with the US president asking for American diplomatic intervention to make sure Ukraine does not rain missiles down on his birthday party for a war he cannot win. Putin's aide, Yuri Ushakov, confirmed that the Russian president had discussed a ceasefire for the May 9th holiday during the phone call. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov then said that no definite decision had been made and that it would be for Putin to decide on the specific terms. And then Zelensky cut through all of it in one sentence. He said Ukraine would find out exactly what this was about, whether it was a few hours of security for a parade in Moscow or something more. That is the Ukrainian president publicly, calmly, and with devastating precision telling the world that Putin's ceasefire proposal is not a peace gesture. It is a theatrical prop, a shield for a parade, nothing more. Russia, on May 4th, declared a unilateral ceasefire with Ukraine from May 8th to 9th, when Moscow marks its annual World War II Victory Day commemorations, and threatened a massive missile strike on Kyiv if Ukraine violated it. A ceasefire with a threat attached. That is not diplomacy. That is a hostage arrangement. Stop shooting at my parade, or we bomb your capital. And yet even this threat is hollow, because if Russia had the capability to launch a genuinely decisive strike on Kyiv at will, the war would already look very different from what the numbers on the ground are telling us right now. We are going to get into those numbers in detail, and they are brutal. Zelensky's response was precise. He said it was time for Russian leaders to take real steps to end their war, especially since Russia's own defense ministry believes it cannot hold a parade in Moscow without Ukraine's goodwill. Read that again slowly. Ukraine's goodwill. The defense ministry of a country that invaded Ukraine, killed tens of thousands of Ukrainian civilians, and has been lobbing missiles and drones at Ukrainian cities for 4 years, is now implicitly dependent on Ukraine's restraint to protect its most important national holiday. That is not strength. That is not what victory looks like. That is what the beginning of the end of a failing war looks like, dressed up in red and gold bunting for a parade that can barely fill the square. Because the parade on May 9th is just the surface of this story. What is underneath it is an 18-layer confession of military and economic collapse that Putin desperately does not want you to see. And we are going to pull every single layer apart. Let's talk about what the absence of military hardware from Red Square actually means. Because Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov has been working overtime trying to spin this into something other than the humiliation it plainly is. And I have to say, the excuses coming out of Moscow right now are almost impressive in their audacity. Almost. Peskov stood in front of reporters and said with a completely straight face that the reason there will be no tanks, no missiles, no armored vehicles on display in Moscow on May 9th is because Ukraine has, in his words, launched a full-scale terrorist attack. That is the official Kremlin explanation. Ukraine is the terrorist. Ukraine, the country that has been on the receiving end of 4+ years of Russian missiles, Russian drones, Russian strikes on hospitals, schools, and civilian infrastructure, is apparently the aggressor threatening peaceful Moscow. The hypocrisy is so thick you could cut it with a javelin. Let me put some numbers on what Russia has actually done to Ukraine, because Peskov's terrorist framing deserves to be buried under the weight of verified data. According to CSIS, since February 2022, Russian forces have suffered nearly 1.2 million casualties, more losses than any major power in any war since World War II. Russian strikes from ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones have left Ukraine's energy system able to meet only 60% of national electricity demand as of January 2026, creating prolonged blackouts across the country, including in Kyiv. That is what Russia has been doing to Ukrainian civilians, systematically dismantling their ability to heat their homes, power their hospitals, and keep their lights on through winter. And Peskov wants to talk about terrorism. The projection is breathtaking. Now, let's look at what is really behind the decision to strip the parade of everything that made it meaningful. Because there are actually two distinct reasons, and both of them tell you something critical about the state of Russia's war machine in May 2026. The first reason is the one Moscow will never say out loud, but has essentially already admitted by canceling the hardware column. Russia cannot spare the equipment. Russia's war economy is under mounting strain. The country spends roughly half its budget on the armed forces, the military-industrial complex, domestic security, and debt service. While the war sustains jobs and industrial activity, it produces few lasting assets or productivity gains. Tank factories are working overtime, but automobile producers have cut shifts. Every tank that could theoretically roll through Red Square is needed in Ukraine. Every armored vehicle, every missile launcher, every piece of equipment that Putin would normally parade in front of the cameras is either already destroyed in Ukraine or racing to replace something that was. There is nothing left over for theater. As of early 2026, open source intelligence documents approximately 3,500 or more Russian tanks destroyed, damaged, abandoned, or captured, representing roughly 50 to 60% of Russia's pre-war tank inventory. These confirmed losses represent some of the highest equipment losses of any post-World War II conflict. Let that number land properly. More than half of Russia's pre-war tank fleet gone. And those are only the image-confirmed losses, the ones that researchers were able to verify with photographic or video evidence. The actual number is almost certainly higher. Russia has been compensating by pulling Soviet-era equipment out of storage, tanks that were sitting in warehouses since the Cold War, rushing them through whatever refurbishment is possible, and sending them to Ukraine. That is the depth of the equipment crisis. And Putin wants to stand in front of the world and parade what exactly? The storage receipts? The second reason is the one that Peskov accidentally confirmed while trying to avoid it. Russian military blogger and Komsomolskaya Pravda war correspondent Alexander Kots writing on Telegram, suggested the parade itself was almost cancelled entirely because of the threat posed by Ukrainian drones. Meanwhile, open-source military analyst Roslyn Lev pointed out that the main vulnerability was not the parade itself, but the staging areas where vehicles are assembled and stored ahead of rehearsals. When military equipment participates in parades, it is initially parked and prepared for rehearsals in remote areas outside Moscow and specially designated zones. It would be much easier to strike such areas with drones or missiles. That is the operational reality that Putin is trapped by. Even if Russia had the equipment to display, the act of gathering it, staging it, rehearsing the parade route, and parking it in designated areas would turn it into a target list. Ukraine's drone campaign has reached deep enough into Russian territory that no staging area near Moscow is genuinely safe. And if Ukraine hit a rehearsal column, Putin would not just lose the equipment, he would lose the entire political narrative of the parade in the most public way imaginable. On Tuesday, Russia's central bank head, Elvira Nabiullina, said the country was facing an unprecedented labor shortage. Never before in the history of modern Russia have we experienced such a labor shortage, she said. We've never had anything like this. And this is having an impact on the entire economic situation. An unprecedented labor shortage in the middle of a war. Think about what that means. Russia has been feeding men into Ukraine at a rate that is now visibly hollowing out its civilian workforce. The factories that are supposed to be producing military equipment are running short of workers. The economy that is supposed to be sustaining the war effort is running on fumes and mandatory overtime. And none of that shows up in the Kremlin's public messaging. But it shows up in the parade, or rather, in the absence of one. Economic growth slowed to 0.6% in 2025, and the International Monetary Fund estimated that growth would remain slow at 0.8% in 2026. Russia also faces a capital problem. The country receives limited foreign investment and is unable to borrow on international markets. To finance the Ukraine war, the Kremlin has borrowed at home and raised taxes. Higher taxes, double-digit interest rates, a labor market being consumed by the front lines, food prices rising out of control. These are not the economic indicators of a country that is winning a war. These are the indicators of a war economy that is beginning to eat itself, and the Russian civilian population is absorbing every bite of the cost. Now compare this to what Victory Day 2025 looked like, because that comparison is where the story really becomes stark. Last year's parade was the largest since Russia sent troops into Ukraine, drawing the most global leaders to Moscow in a decade. It featured over 11,500 troops and more than 180 military vehicles, including tanks, armored infantry vehicles, and artillery used on the battlefield in Ukraine, as well as huge Yars nuclear-tipped intercontinental ballistic missile launchers and drones carried on military trucks. High-profile guests included Chinese President Xi Jinping, Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, and Slovakia's Prime Minister, Robert Fico. That was 12 months ago. 1 year. And in 12 months, Russia has gone from hosting 27 world leaders at a parade featuring 180 military vehicles and nuclear missile launchers to hosting essentially nobody at a parade featuring no military vehicles at all. That is not a gradual decline. That is a cliff edge. And what pushed Russia over it is 4 more years of a war it claimed it had already won. What does Putin have left to show the world on May 9th? Then a few acrobatic jets painting the sky in Russian tricolor. Some soldiers marching in formation with no equipment behind them. Video screens showing footage from the front lines in Ukraine, which is his way of telling his own people that the special military operation is still somehow a victory. Weapons in it. That is the Victory Day 2026 summary. And we have not even gotten to the most damaging data yet, because the military equipment numbers we just covered are only the beginning of what the scoreboard actually looks like for Russia in this war. Stay with me, because in the next section, we are going into the full accounting, and it is going to reframe everything you think you know about where this conflict actually stands. Let's get into the numbers, because this is where the Kremlin's narrative completely falls apart. And this is where the Victory Day humiliation stops being just a symbolic embarrassment and starts being a measurable, verifiable, data-confirmed indictment of everything Putin told his country this war would be. When you line up what Russia has lost in Ukraine against what it has gained, the picture that emerges is not the picture of a country that is winning. It is the picture of a country that has been bleeding itself dry for 4 years in exchange for territory gains so small, so slow, and so costly that no honest military analyst anywhere on the planet is calling this a Russian victory. Not one. Let's start with the human cost, because that is always where wars are really decided. Not in the equipment columns or the economic reports, but in the human beings who are not coming home. According to a February 2026 estimate by The Economist, Russia has suffered between 1 million and 1.25 million casualties, including between 230,000 and 430,000 dead. The Wall Street Journal's February 2026 estimate puts Russian casualties at 1.2 million, including 325,000 killed. And in April 2026, the Netherlands Military Intelligence and Security Service estimated Russia has suffered approximately 1.2 million permanent losses, including more than 500,000 of them dead. 500,000 Russian soldiers dead. That is not a number you recover from quickly. That is not a number you paper over with a parade flyover. That is a generational wound to Russia's military capacity and to Russian society itself. And it is a number that Putin's state media will never say out loud to the Russian people. This staggering figure, if accurate, represents a scale of human loss not seen by Russia since World War II, far exceeding its casualties in Afghanistan or Chechnya. It suggests a profound miscalculation of military strategy and a disregard for human life that challenges the very notion of a sustainable, long-term conflict for any modern nation. And what has Russia purchased with those 500,000 lives? Analysis of ISW data for the 4-week period from March 24th to April 21st, 2026 indicates that Russian forces suffered a net loss of 2 square miles of Ukrainian territory during that period. During the prior 4-week period, Russia suffered a net loss of 4 square miles. Russia is not just failing to advance meaningfully. In recent weeks, it has been losing ground. 2 square miles lost in a single month. After 4 years of war, after 500,000 dead, after burning through over 1 trillion rubles in military spending, the rate of advance that Russia managed to sustain through its most aggressive offensive periods, between 15 and 70 meters per day, according to CSIS, is slower than almost any major offensive campaign in any war in the last century. 70 meters per day is not a blitzkrieg. It is barely a crawl. And even that crawl is now reversing. Russia has held the military initiative on the battlefield in Ukraine since roughly January 2024 and has been on offense. But Russian battlefield casualties and fatalities are significantly greater than Ukrainian casualties and fatalities, with a ratio of roughly 2.5 to 1. Russia is the attacker. Russia has numerical superiority. Russia has a defense industrial base running at maximum wartime production. Russia has been recruiting between 3,000 and 4,000 soldiers a month to replace its dead and wounded. And it is still losing men at 2.5 times the rate Ukraine is losing them. That is not what winning looks like. That is what a meat grinder looks like from the side that is feeding it. Now let's look at the equipment destruction, because this is directly connected to why Red Square is going to be empty on May 9th. As of early 2026, Russia has lost over 24,000 pieces of military equipment across all categories, including over 13,855 tanks and armored vehicles. By comparison, Ukraine has lost approximately 1,190 pieces of equipment across the same period. Russia has lost more than double the equipment Ukraine has across every major category. And those are only the confirmed, documented losses. The actual figures are higher. This is the equipment that was supposed to be rolling through Moscow next Friday. This is where the tanks went. This is where the armored vehicles went. They went to Ukraine, and they did not come back. And the ones that did come back came back in such a state that they are better described as scrap than as parade-ready military hardware. U.S. officials estimate that Russia has lost more than 3,000 tanks, a higher number than its entire pre-war active-duty tank inventory. Russia has responded to these losses by mobilizing its economy to support the war effort, transitioning the defense industry to round-the-clock production. Running low on stockpiles, Russia has focused most of its defense production on refurbishing old equipment rather than producing new versions, particularly in the face of sanctions restricting the import of critical components. Round-the-clock production just to break even on losses. Refurbishing Cold War-era tanks because new production cannot keep pace with the rate of destruction. Sanctions cutting off the critical components needed for modern weapon systems. And on top of all of that, a labor shortage so severe that the head of Russia's own central bank described it as unprecedented in modern Russian history. This is the war machine that Putin is trying to hold together while simultaneously planning a Victory Day parade. No wonder there is nothing left to put on the street. Then there is the energy picture. And this one matters because it is the part that is quietly strangling Russia's ability to sustain everything else. At least 40% of Russia's oil export capacity is at a halt following Ukrainian drone attacks on all three of Russia's major Western oil export ports, including Novorossiysk on the Black Sea and Primorsk and Ust-Luga on the Baltic Sea. The attacks cut flows through these two Baltic ports to about a third of their previous level, reducing Moscow's oil income by more than $1 billion, according to Bloomberg calculations based on market data. From March 25th, Ukraine's drone campaign against Russian energy infrastructure has been one of the most strategically effective operations of the entire war. Not because it is killing soldiers, but because it is cutting off the revenue stream that funds it. The war. Russia's oil income is not a secondary concern. It is the financial engine of the entire military machine, and Ukraine has been systematically dismantling it from the inside out. Repeated Ukrainian attacks on the oil refinery at Tuapse on Russia's Black Sea coast have showcased Moscow's economic vulnerability. Images of the unfolding environmental disaster have underscored what some have seen as a slow response by authorities. And just days ago, on May 1st, Ukraine pulled off a drone strike against Russia's Shagol airfield that damaged 4 aircraft, including Su-57 and Su-34 fighter jets. The Su-57 is Russia's most advanced fighter aircraft. Ukraine's drones are reaching Russia's most advanced combat platforms inside Russian territory. Think about that when you hear Peskov talking about Ukraine committing terrorism. Ukraine is hitting military targets deep inside Russia with precision. Russia has been hitting Ukrainian apartment buildings, kindergartens, and power stations for 4 years. The terrorism framing is not just dishonest, it is obscene. And here's the part of this story that carries the most strategic weight heading into May 9th. An anonymous military expert noted that the possibility of air raid alerts in Moscow on May 9th was likely enough to deter the Kremlin leadership from displaying equipment. That possibility alone might incentivize some of the air defenses to be moved from the front back to Moscow, opening even more gaps in Russian territory. Russia is in a position where protecting its own capital on its own most important national holiday requires pulling air defense systems away from the front lines. Every S-300 or S-400 battery that gets repositioned around Moscow to protect Putin's parade is a battery that is no longer covering Russian troops in Ukraine. The parade is not just a symbol. The preparations for it are actively degrading Russia's defensive capability in the very war it is supposedly winning. What we are watching in real time as May 9th approaches and Red Square sits empty of everything that once made the Victory Day parade mean something is the physical manifestation of a war that Russia has already lost in every meaningful strategic sense. The objectives that Putin stated at the start of this invasion, the denazification of Ukraine, the forced neutrality, the seizure of the entire Donbass, the subjugation of a sovereign government, none of them have been achieved. Ukraine still stands. Its government still functions. Its military is still fighting. And Russia is standing in front of the world on its most important holiday with nothing to show for 4 years of catastrophic losses, except soldiers marching past an empty road where the tanks used to be. In the next section, we are going to talk about what all of this means going forward, because the story does not end on May 9th. It is only getting more complicated from here. So what does all of this actually mean going forward? Because the temptation, when you look at a humiliation this complete, this documented, this impossible to spin away, is to assume that the end is near, that Putin is about to fold, that the stripped-down parade, with no weapons and no world leaders and no tanks, is the final chapter before Russia comes to the table and ends this war on terms that reflect the reality on the ground. I want to engage with that question seriously, because the answer is more complicated than the headlines are suggesting. And understanding the complexity is what separates genuine analysis from wishful thinking. Let's start with the ceasefire situation as it stands right now on May 5th, 2026. Because the dueling ceasefire announcements of the last 48 hours tell you everything you need to know about where both sides actually are. Russia declared a unilateral ceasefire from May 8th to 9th and said it expected Ukraine to follow suit. It said Moscow's forces would take all measures to ensure the safety of commemorations marking the defeat of Nazi Germany. And then Zelensky announced his own ceasefire starting earlier, from the night of May 5th to 6th, and framed it with language that was surgical in its precision. He said Ukraine believes human life is far more valuable than any anniversary celebration. He did not say Ukraine would respect Russia's ceasefire. He announced his own, on his own terms, on his own timeline, and left Russia to respond to Ukraine's initiative rather than the other way around. That is not the posture of a side that is losing. That is a leader who understands exactly what leverage looks like and how to use it. Ukraine had been wary of the notion of a brief ceasefire rather than moves toward a prolonged end to fighting. Ukraine accused Russia of repeatedly violating previous ceasefires, including an alleged Easter truce during Orthodox Easter, when Kyiv said it recorded more than 400 violations. 400 violations during a single short ceasefire. That is not a negotiating partner acting in good faith. That is a pattern of behavior that Zelensky and his military leadership have seen enough times to recognize instantly. Putin wants a ceasefire for May 9th for the same reason he wanted one last year. Not because he wants peace, but because he wants his parade to go smoothly. And then he wants to resume operations the moment the cameras turn off. Zelensky said it directly. They want the parade to pass calmly for a few hours and then resume attacks afterward. Ukraine is not going to let that cycle run one more time unopposed. But here is the harder question that analysts are wrestling with right now, and it is the one that matters most for where this war goes after May 9th. Does this level of public humiliation, this visible, undeniable, parade-sized confession of military exhaustion, actually change anything on the ground? Does it bring Russia closer to a genuine, negotiated settlement? Or does it simply mean that Putin doubles down, escalates his rhetoric, and uses the humiliation of Victory Day as domestic propaganda fuel to justify continued sacrifice from the Russian people? A Russian field pollster survey conducted in mid-February 2026 found that 53% of Russian respondents believe a transition to peace negotiations should be made, while only 38% favored the continuation of the military operation. The majority of the Russian population inside Russia, surveyed by a Russian polling organization, wants negotiations, not victory.